Welcome everyone to another episode of Dardashe, the podcast where we talk to amazing, inspiring Palestinians about their lives and the work that they do. Today, I'm joined with Iyad el-Baghdadi, who is the president of the Kawaakibi Foundation, an activist, and the author of the Middle East Crisis Factory. I know you're currently in Oslo, in Norway, and not in your home. I wanted to ask you, how come?
Yeah, it's a big question, especially when you mentioned the word home.
Yeah.
Because I am a Palestinian exile. My family come from Jaffa originally, from Manshia. Both sides of my family, my father and my mother. My mother's family is Samhuri. My father was born in Jaffa, but the family after the Nakba became diasporized. Very typical Palestinian story. My father grew up in Egypt. My mother grew up between Syria and Kuwait. But I myself, was born and raised in the Gulf, mostly in the United Arab Emirates. I spent the first 37 years of my life over there. I had no experience living outside of the Arab region until 2014. I became an activist in 2011 with the start of the Arab Spring uprisings. And whether a good thing or a bad thing, but I became prominent and well connected very quickly. Mainly because I decided that my niche should be bridging the knowledge gap by translating what's happening from Arabic to English. And that, tweeting in English was also interesting because it was also a form of self-censorship, because I knew that if I spoke only in Arabic, I would be a lot more vulnerable, and the authorities in the country in which I lived, which was the United Arab Emirates, would not tolerate me as much. They're always fearful, or at least they're always impatient with people who have a big footprint in the Arabic language. So it was a form of self-censorship, but it ended up also being a form of protection, because in 2014, I was arrested. There's a big story and a background to this, which, I'll spare you all of the details. But I found myself in a jail cell, with the people who do not have, because they had issued orders for me to be expelled from the country. And they call it deportation, and they have to send you back to home, quote unquote. And that was the questions, like, are you going to liberate Palestine so you can send me back there? So I end up in this cell with all of the people who have nowhere to be sent back to. And at the time, it was mostly Syrians and Palestinians. So I'm basically sitting in a cell with Palestinians, with Lebanese travel documents, with Egyptian travel documents, with the Jordanian background, with Iraqi background, etc. We are, after all, a diasporized people. But long story short, I managed to, after leaving prison, of course, it was not secure in prison because I had an Egyptian travel document. And there was a big fear that they will send me to Egypt, where I would be disappeared. Thankfully, I was actually sent to, through certain interventions, to Malaysia, where I lived in the airport for about a month, because I had literally nowhere to go. But eventually, through certain connections and through certain invitations, I managed to be invited to speak at a human rights conference in Oslo in 2014. And that was my opportunity to apply for asylum. And here I am. I live in Norway now. It's not the worst country to live in. I went from a country like the United Arab Emirates, which was, again, an oil-rich, a country which is rich in fossil fuels and natural resources, to another which is also rich in oil. And but the difference, of course, is that Norway tops the chart when it comes to democracy and free speech, while the UAE is at the bottom of the chart everywhere. So I think that maybe certain people in the UAE right now are thinking maybe we should have killed him in prison rather than allowed him to be free.
Yeah, I wanted to ask. I know you didn't want to, go into the details, but briefly, what was the justification from them for your arrest?
Oh, there was no justification. They don't need one.
Okay.
I was basically, it was literally in Arabic, awamir samia, higher orders. And there was no trial. There's nothing of that. It was simply, we decided you have to leave. That's it. Of course, the background, I mean, I don't want to get into the juicy details of the background right now, because first of all, it might be long and long-winded and requires a little bit of context, but also it might, I don't want to jeopardize the safety of people who might still be inside.
Sure.
But essentially, it was, of course, related to my political activism.
Yeah. And I think what grabbed my attention is that you began your activism in 2011, I'm assuming around the Arab Spring. What led you to that? What sparked something in you that maybe awoken something in you? And where is that today in terms of kind of its journey and trajectory internally?
So, I mean, every Palestinian has an activist inside them. I actually recently been having conversation with my own team. And most of my team, I mean, a lot of my team, you'll see them on Twitter, but some of them we don't really speak publicly because of the security situation around us. But one of them said this. He said, if we go around looking for activists in the Arab region or the MENA region generally, there is always an advantage because every Palestinian is a potential activist. Because we are so affected and impacted by everything that happens in the political realm, speaking about politics and speaking about activism and this is something that happens all the time in our families. And I don't think there's many Palestinian families who don't have a history of activism somewhere in, if not the immediate family, then the extended family. And this is a fact. I think we have been fighting longer than any other Arab people. I mean, we're going on four generations now, and we will be going for another few generations until we liberate Palestine and come back home. But essentially, I can't really put a date on when I started my activism, but I was not active in a sense that I was not out there on Twitter or social media saying that these are my political opinions, etc. What really prompted me was the courage of everybody who took to the streets at the same time. To be honest, before the Arab Spring, I thought that this moment is not going to come anytime soon. I knew that this entire regional order is lacking in legitimacy, and it will break sooner or later. It was very obvious that this is not sustainable. There was this constant feeling that this is not sustainable. But I was 33 at the time, and I think 32, and I thought that maybe in 20 years we will see something like this, maybe even longer. And at the same time, I thought, maybe the main work that we need to do until then is intellectual work. We need to lay a foundation, etc. But then things happened fast, and you had to embrace that this is happening. So I started tweeting on the 25th of January, 2011, the same day as the Egyptian uprising. The rest is history.
Yeah, and you reflect a lot, and I'm sure you do. I do as well on kind of, it's been what, 10 years now, almost since that time. What are your feelings about kind of that trajectory and where a lot of the region stands today?
Well, whenever I meet with my friends who are activists from 2011, it's clear because there are people who try to call into question whether 2011 was a point of starting anything. And it's true that there is a history before it. There are many people who have been active for much longer, especially in the Palestinian context, of course. But it's also very clear whenever we speak, even when we are trying to call into question the importance of 2011, 2011 is always mentioned. It is still a reference point for a lot of people, and it's also the point at which many of us met each other. We were living in silos. Like basically, it was like the Islamists only spoke to the Islamists, the Salafis only spoke to the Salafis, the leftists only spoke to the leftists, the liberals had their own circles, and then everybody poured onto the same streets and into the same squares, and also the virtual square, which is the online public sphere. that was the moment where we really got to know each other and got to know that, yeah, other people who have different perspectives and different grievances and different stories that exist. And some people loved it and some people didn't like it. I mean, there are people who didn't like the fact that, hey, there's so many people not like us. But there are also people who really like the fact that, hey, there's so many people who are, who are living side by side and we don't know about them, and we should be, we should be talking. I put myself squarely among the people who like the fact that there's so much diversity and there's so many people to get to know. And I feel that there has been a thinning of ideology since then, because before that, people kind of like, they wanted to hang around with people who followed their ideology. There was like a tribalism around ideology. I think that has really broken down increasingly. I think after the Trump years, especially, I feel like we live in a post-ideology kind of world where we're really organizing around values rather than around ideology. I don't think, like, even if you ask me what's your ideology, I don't even know what my ideology is anymore. But I'm much clearer. I'm clearer than ever when it comes to my values and who I want to associate with. But then you're asking about the trajectory, and obviously there has been an intellectual transition or intellectual evolution that I myself have gone through and many others have gone through. I mean, sometimes I feel like I could read tweets of mine that I wrote like 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. I'm like, I want to punch this guy. But there are others where I think, okay, I get him. I get where he was, or what was, in the end, I'm also a creature of my own surroundings. And I did grow up in a very specific country, in a specific family, in a specific time, with specific influences. But I mean, when it comes to the trajectory of the Arab Spring itself, I mean, this is a point that I make in the book, which is that, first of all, I don't shy away from using the word Arab Spring, and I have my own reasons for that. There are people who don't like to use it, but I don't speak about it as a 2011 event. I speak about it as an era of our history that started in 2011 and that lasts for 30 years. So we're speaking about something between 2011 and 2041. We are 10 years into it. We're not 10 years after it, but we're 10 years into it, and we still have 20 years to go.
Interesting. I wanna talk about that intellectual evolution you talk about. I know you seem to be anchoring yourself in values rather than ideology, but is there an intellectual tradition that you are gravitating towards, and maybe where was that starting point and where are you now?
Well, I mean, I grew up in a very Palestinian family. I remember points of like, when you ask me like how long back do you remember your own, like what's the earliest memory you have, for example? And I mean, I would tell you, for example, the Sadat assassination. I was 3 years old or 2 years old. The Camp David Accords around the same, around the same time. The invasion of Lebanon, 1982. The first Intifada, I was 10 years old, 1987. The Oslo Accords, for example, 1993, I had a fight with my father. Things like that. It's basically our history. So it's not impersonal for us. It's basically something which is related to your family, related to your your relationship with your family, with your extended family, etc. But later on in my life, after the Iraq War, specifically after the quote unquote war on terror, I started to gravitate more towards Salafi jihadism and Islamism generally. I did go through a radicalization experience for a period of like 3 or 4 years. This was like almost 20 years ago. 20 years ago. And of course, I had, my earlier education, I received a Western education. I did O-levels, GCE, basically British medium. And then when I went to college, it was an American college. So I had that background, but at the same time, I had this gravitation towards Islamic topics, drifted more and more towards the Salafi end of the spectrum. And if anybody actually went in and came out, he'd tell you that people who leave, they leave with an intense anger. They leave thinking, oh, I want to destroy this thing that took away my soul. And I don't want to make it about Salafism per se, because I don't want to be unfair to Salafis who are just regular people. But I'm talking specifically about radicalized narratives within the jihadi Salafi spectrum. But later on, when I drifted out of it, I actually became enamored with Western ideologies that were non-interventionist. I thought that, okay, here's a current of Western thought, which I can kind of see that we have some kind of intersection, mainly because they're also against wars, they're also against intervention, they're also against, these things that that hurt us so much. And for a while, I was reading a lot of libertarian literature, whether it's right libertarian or left libertarian. And I, of course, libertarian generally who are really well informed in that tradition, they know that there is such a thing as left libertarianism, and they're embarrassed by American libertarians who kind of like gave the whole word a really bad, basically they ruined it for everybody else essentially. But since then, I mean, since basically leaving that behind and embracing basically the Arab Spring and the rich intellectual tradition that comes with that, because you're meeting everybody, you're meeting people who read Gramsci and people who read from the left to the right, people who read Hayek and von Mises, etc., and also people who read more traditional. This is why we eventually called our organization Al-Kawaakibi, because Al-Kawaakibi was a Syrian, Muslim intellectual who used native narratives, including religious narratives, to speak against tyranny and to criticize the lack of, the lack of a tradition, a native tradition, which has really strong teeth against tyranny. So I would say I'm very, eclectic when it comes to that. Something that my library behind me kind of reflects, because you'll see many different titles from across the board. But yeah, I'm no longer slotting myself as I really cringe when people really try to define themselves in terms of ideology. I think you're a human being, you're wider than ideology.
That's fascinating, and I think it takes a lot of intellectual honesty to be able to reflect and kind of track that journey, and someone who's introspective. And I think that brings me to kind of a theme that I mean, we met through Twitter, and one of the things that really caught my eye in terms of what you talk about is trauma, and kind of that journey. It's a journey I personally have been going on over the last year now, and still early days, but something that I feel very strongly about. What led you there, and how's it going?
Well, I do believe that we're all traumatized and that our region is full of trauma. Not only our generation, but we inherit trauma. It's intergenerational trauma. And I do believe that a lot of behavior that we're kind of used to in our communities and we interpret it as culture is actually trauma. Even family, families, certain families act a certain way, etc. It's also intergenerational trauma and things that have not been said. That said, when you have a broken bone, and you can see very clearly that you have a broken bone, you are forced to address it. You're forced, basically, it pains, it hurts, you can't really, basically it demands to be taken care of immediately. This is unlike having a silent illness, diabetes, for example. You could go for years without even knowing that you have a problem. And then by the time you discover that there's a problem, it's already too late, or it's already become something really bad. I say the same when it comes to trauma, because we're all traumatized, but not all of us realize that we're traumatized. Mm-hmm. And in a certain way, me going through a traumatic experience with prison, living in an airport, living in a refugee camp, my family, being hurt really badly after that, trying to come to terms with that, a lot of my friends and being killed. All of that gave me severe PTSD around 2017, which was bad enough that I was suicidal. The fact that this is basically the analog of having a broken bone, where you have to stop, you have to slow down, you have to address it. I don't believe that I'm more traumatized than others. I do believe that others are as traumatized, maybe even more traumatized than me. But something happened in my life to force me to address it. And that's when I took some time out. I had to, I'm very thankful that I live in Norway, where I remember, I was approved for CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for PTSD. And I remember going and seeing my therapist, was a fantastic, therapist. And then going back home and getting a pizza on the way. And I'm like, in which other country is like 60 minutes of therapy cheaper than a pizza? Or maybe it's the reverse, and the pizza is because everything is expensive here. But it is a point that it's right now one of the main problems with talking about trauma is that the current modalities are expensive, and they're not available for people who don't have the means. But I was lucky that it was basically we have health insurance over here. It covers these things, so it wasn't that expensive. But really, everything changed after that in 2018, when I discovered other modalities, specifically psychedelic assisted therapies, which were experimental. They're still experimental, of course, and I think it'll take a couple of years, maybe more, before they are legalized or licensed, at least. But they're highly effective, and the reason why they're highly effective, I think this is worth its own study, its own conversation. But the reason why they're exciting is because they get behind two of the most important problems with talk therapy right now. One of them is cost, because you don't it's assisted therapy, which means that you become your own therapist. It's self-therapy. It allows you to meet a much wiser version of yourself. But also it is, there's always the idea, this is something that was difficult for me when I was recovering. The person you're sitting with, the therapist, as caring as they can be, and as intelligent and as warm and as well educated as they can be, they don't come from your cultural background, and they're not, they read about your experiences maybe, but they don't really, feel it. Mm-hmm. And this was always a barrier, especially for people of immigrant background in a country which is mostly privileged. This gets behind it. This gets basically behind this whole problem. It gets around the whole problem, because you're your own therapist in the end. You're the one who decides what is the norm. And so I do believe that this is, if we can, I think a lot can be said about this, mainly because I do believe that trauma is another dimension of history that's not talked about. Mm-hmm. If we actually go back, I think I remember listening to a podcast once which talks about the history of PTSD in pre-modernity. That people even 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, they would get PTSD too, but they would never know how to diagnose it. But people did live with the effects for the rest of their lives. Of course, there's a whole conversation about whether we should call it PTSD, because we're living, especially people like me, we get re-traumatized all the time. Mm-hmm. Trauma is a continuous part of our lives, which is why therapy has to be a continuous part of our lives. But I do believe that if we want to talk about the future of the region, we have to talk about trauma and trauma recovery.
I couldn't agree more. I think at least within Palestinian society, it's and within my own community here, it's extremely difficult to normalize a conversation around this and make it accessible. I mean, forget even getting to a point where it's financially affordable. But I think there is still a taboo over therapy and
yeah. And to be honest, the taboo is, my father is a cardiologist. He's retired now. And he had a very severe breakdown after my arrest. He still hasn't recovered, but he's someone he's a cardiologist himself, and he's the one who used to tell us when we were kids that we should not have a stigma around mental health. But when it came to him, he had the same stigma. And even he was resisting. He's like, no, I'm not crazy, I'm etc. So it goes deep, it runs deep, and I think that we should appreciate that, and we should lead by example.
Exactly.
So one of the main things that I decided to do early is to be very open about this. Most people, they don't speak about it, and because not many people speak about it, they think that, hey, I'm alone. I'm the only one who's going through this because nobody's talking about it. But the moment I started talking about it, I realized that no, everybody has the same problem. It's just that many people don't want to talk about it. And the moment I started talking about it, they started reaching out.
Yeah, I agree. And I feel the same way. I think it's something for those with a platform that feel very strongly about it, especially with an audience that is based in our part of the world. I think it's very important to keep pushing and normalizing. In my experience, my journey with therapy kind of opened up also my approach to my strategic thinking. I don't know if it was the same for you, but it was a very interesting parallel of a journey. And one thing I also see you talk a lot about is strategic thinking in general, and specifically in relation to also the Palestinian cause. So I just wanted to ask you about your influences and what has formulated, what framework of strategy has formulated in your mind over the years, and has that had any connection to kind of this growth and evolution journey you've been on?
Well, in 2011, of course, it was a lot of activists from different Arab countries. Out of 22 Arab countries, 20 had some kind of uprising. And I was living in one of the two that didn't, of course. So we're facing people who, I'm just setting the stage. You're Palestinian, and Egyptians had an 18-day uprising, and they think that they won. And I'm like, we have been fighting for 70 years. This is not the end. I guarantee you this is not the end. And you're trying to make people understand that, no, this is long term. You need to know that you need to be pushing for a generation. It's not some like, do you think that they're just going to let you be? Do you think that the powers that you pushed are just going to just sit and take it? So I think part of strategic thinking really is the fact that we come from a cause that has been active and suffering this hasn't started with the Nakba, of course. Basically, this is 100 years now, or more than 100 years. So that's part of it. But then again, I think part of my own education, before I became an activist, I was a startup consultant. My job was to strategize. My job was basically to of course, strategize for startups, etc. But I think you're right that the trauma recovery is related, because part of what you get when you recover for trauma is that you rediscover your own patience and your own wisdom. And you start to understand exactly how you became this person that you are, and how something that happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even 40 years ago impacts who you are today. And that gives you a long-term view, because you're like, okay, if I want to win, I have to set my sight 20 years into the future. I cannot set my sight 5 years or 2 years into the future. I feel like one of the main problems with the movement in general, I'm not talking only within Palestine, but in the wider region, is that instead of working on a single 20-year plan, we are working on subsequent, continuous one-year plans. And so we continue to fight the same battle over and over and over again, instead of really setting our sight beyond that and working diligently on the long term. But yeah, I have positioned myself right from the start, increasingly in the last 3 years or so. And this is basically the position that our organization, Kawaakibi Center, also takes, which is that we are strategists, and we develop strategies, and we try to lead by example. And of course, a lot of this is really being surfaced over the next 2 years.
And I want to talk about Palestine specifically, I think, where in a moment where there's a transition from a paradigm that has failed over the last 30 years, the Oslo paradigm, and one that is still unknown and to be defined. And so what do you think, I'm sure you've given this thought, but it's a big question, what do you think our national strategy should be moving forward?
Well, interestingly, it is, I mean, I don't know how much I should say.
Say what you can.
But I mean, yeah, because keep in mind that there are certain things that are becoming increasingly clear now. You might, I mean, I don't think we have introduced this so far, but I am living under protection in Oslo because you know, agents of the Saudi regime have wanted me dead since 2018. And the threats continue. And when we look beyond this, we find out that the Saudis are not lone actors, and they coordinate with others in the region. And it's up to you how to fill in the blanks. But essentially, you know, it's very clear that the structure of tyranny in the region has shifted, or at least has been more exposed. I think it has always been the case, but it's been increasingly more exposed. In 2011, we thought that we are facing, or at least a lot of, I don't want to say we, but rather a lot of people on the streets, they went down saying the people demand the downfall of the regimes. And by the regimes, they meant Mubarak, Gaddafi, Ali Abdullah Saleh, Assad, you know, bin Ali, etc., the people who were their immediate tyrants, who, as you know, might have, you know, practically all of them continuously spoke about the Palestinian cause without doing anything for it. Essentially, this was 2011, but by 2013, 2014, around the time I was arrested, it was clear for us at the time that the main actors, the main people who were intervening and forming a counter-revolutionary wall were certain Gulf states, specifically the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So, you know, I come from this unique situation of being a Palestinian from the UAE who's an Arab Spring activist. Now, increasingly, it's being clear also that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are not lone actors, and their connection, their direct strategic and intelligence connections to the Israelis is becoming more transparent. We have seen, for example, who provides them with the hacking technology, who provides them with diplomatic support. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. And the iceberg is really goes deep into that. Into, you know, behind, you know, what is unseen is far more than what is seen when it comes to this. And this, of course, my work is exposing this, and this is the reason why I live under protection. But if we want to pivot to what our national strategy should be, I would say 5 main long-term goals. And keep in mind, I'm talking 20 years. We have to, I think the most important thing is that we have to unite and re-legitimize our polity. Unite and re-legitimize Palestinians. And this continues to be the heaviest lift, and this continues to be the thing which is the most sensitive for our adversaries. And it is the one thing I think they will do the most to disrupt. Especially that doing this requires us to speak to oppose the current status quo, including the current actors, which means that if we try to do this, it's not going to be the Israelis only who will be trying to disrupt this, or you know, their allies in the Arab world. It will also be among the Palestinians themselves, within whoever is the current actors in the Palestinian space, who really have done as much as they can, and they cannot do more, and they have become a liability rather than they've become actively a part of the problem. On the other hand, of course, it's clear that our adversaries have divided us. They have psychologically and physically isolated us from each other. They have deepened our existing divisions. They have kept us divided, and they disrupted all attempts to reverse this. So it makes it very clear that this is the top priority for us. And I think that if we want to adopt 20-year thinking, then we should not try to skip over the details. We should not try to, we shouldn't try to plant a seed and expect the seed to grow immediately. We aren't playing a computer game. This is real life, So, which means that it doesn't start from us going together and saying, hey, let's create this new initiative for political front, even though that's useful. But essentially, the main lift is to get to know each other. That's it. Simply getting to know each other. We are a very diverse people because we are forced to live in so many different situations. We might not see eye to eye on a lot of things. Someone who lived in Haifa versus someone who lived in Gaza, versus someone who lives in Ramallah, versus someone who lives in Yarmouk in Damascus, versus someone who lived in the Gulf, will have very different lived experiences and very different aspirations and understanding of what it means to be Palestinian and what it means to liberate Palestine even. So I think it starts with really just talking to each other. So I said 5 things and I only mentioned one, but I think this is the heaviest lift.
Yeah, I agree. I think Palestinian fragmentation and segregation is critical. I'm thinking also a lot of conversations around rebuilding a political system that offers space for Palestinians to come and have political representation as part of ending that fragmentation. After the unity.
I think this is a subsequent point. I think the main thing that has to happen first is reestablishing, we are one body, but whose parts have been severed from each other. And I think we just need those parts of the body to reacquaint themselves with each other.
I agree.
Maybe we need 2 or 3 years of that, maybe even 5 years of that before we come together and say, hey, let's build something together.
I think for me, I think about it slightly differently. I think there isn't that space where we can have these conversations. A lot of Palestinians can't visit each other in different spaces. A lot of Palestinians can't go to the UAE, and obviously Palestinians in the UAE can't come here, or maybe now they can. But fragmentation, I think, predominantly is a wedge driven through geography and the lack of ability to move. And I think that can be addressed virtually and in other ways, but we're stalling a process also of self-reflection about where we are and where we want to go. And so, yes, I agree that the first step towards ending fragmentation and developing this unity is getting to know each other. But I think also we can't leave it to the monopolies of power we have in the West Bank and in Gaza and in 48 to drive this to a place that is completely counterproductive. I think in parallel to that process of getting to know each other, there needs to be this system of representation for political conversations and decisions, a vehicle to move national liberation forward. Because
I think we have to define what it even means to what national liberation even means. Because different people mean different things by it, and I think this has always been a sticking point. Well, I think that there are 3 important concepts: vision, leadership, and legitimacy. And I think these 3 are related. They're basically one and the same. And I think it does not start, they can only start with vision. In other words, whoever presents a vision will also become or come into a position of leadership and will establish some sort of legitimacy. So it starts with vision first and foremost, and you cannot really, in order to give a vision, you not only need to give a plan. Sorry, you not only have to give a dream that this is how we have to be eventually, but you have to give a plan how to get there. And this is something which continues because the current actors, as you mentioned, are bankrupt. They're strategically bankrupt. They have nothing to offer. I mean, even when I talk about the current paradigms of course, it's understandable that when a people like ours go through an experience, basically we're fighting for survival, we're being erased. It's understandable that, for example, that we will boost we'll try to document our culture. There are others, for example, who don't have a chance. Like look at the Uyghur, for example, in China, where they have no chance to liberate themselves, but at least they can protect their culture, for example. Similar thing is happening with the Armenians, for example, where again they're facing incredible odds and they feel they're being erased. So it's important to do all of that, but then we have to ask: this is part of the strategy? This is not the entire strategy. I mean, I've taken a lot of heat for talking about, for example, the strategy of resistance from Gaza, and just asking the question: if we continue to do this for 20 years, do we liberate Palestine? I mean, yeah, we need to strengthen and legitimize our backbone, even our military backbone. But what does this mean, and within what context, and within what vision of the future?
No, I agree with that. I think, in my personal experience, the space to be able to formulate and propose a vision is very limited. And so actually the most strategic thing is to create that space. And so for Palestinians who live in Palestine, they've been sold so much bullshit over the last 50 years. It's also a crisis of legitimacy. Even if you come with the most strategically sound vision for the future, I think they'll laugh you off without a sense of legitimacy. And so you're right, they're all intertwined in many ways. It's just, how do you create that space to formulate the different...
I think someone has to start the conversation first and foremost. And I think that the format, whenever you want to mention, when you want to build a vision, it can't be a tweet. It can't even be an article. It has to be something which is full enough, complete enough, so that we can explain the entire context of what you're trying to say, so that people can understand that, and in the end, they don't have to agree with it. Mm-hmm. That's the whole point. It has to be democratic. In a sense, if I want to speak to people, I'm like, listen, I don't mind if you hate me for saying this. I don't mind if you completely disagree with me. Just listen to me. That's all.
Yeah, I know, I hear you. And I think that for me is where I agree with you. I think a democratic space that allows that conversation and leads to political action is kind of where we need to go. Anyways, I want to thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation, Iyad. It's a pleasure, and finally to connect a face and a voice to the tweets. I want to urge people to get the Middle East Crisis Factory. Iyad, where can people find it?
I mean, it's available. I don't know where it's available in Palestine, but right now it's available on on online platforms, Book Depository or Amazon, etc. I don't know if what the ordering options are there for people in Palestine.
No, Amazon is a nightmare to get, but do get the book, everyone. And Iyad, thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.